Okay, everyone, I think we might make a start. Good evening to you all and welcome to the Northern Territory Library for the 2020 Eric Johnston Lecture, and a happy Nadoc week to you all. My name's Patrick Gregory. I'm the Senior Director of Library and Archives NT. I'll be your MC tonight. Welcome to Her Honour, the Administrator, the Honourable Vicky O'Halloran, and to Mr Craig O'Halloran. Welcome also to the Honourable Nariar Kit, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, and welcome to the Honourable Jamesie, Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage, and welcome especially to Thomas Mayer, our Speaker tonight, who will be talking to us on the topic of when the dreaming becomes us and Thomas's family. Thank you for being with us. And given that we're live streaming tonight's lecture, welcome to everyone watching online all around the Territory and perhaps even beyond. It is great to see you all here this evening. It's great to see people in the library again. After the difficult year that we've had, we've really missed hosting events here, so it's wonderful to have everyone here. But we are trying to do a COVID-safe event, so just bear with me briefly for a little bit of housekeeping. We are doing contact tracing for tonight's event, so most of you, we should have your details if you responded on Eventbrite, but if you haven't done that and haven't filled out your name on the register at the front, please do so before you leave. Please practice physical distancing if you can and leave a bit of space between groups and people that you don't know. You'll find hand sanitiser around the library, so please apply that liberally. And non-COVID related, but nonetheless important, if you've got a mobile phone that's not set to silent, now would be an excellent time to rectify that situation. So to get tonight's proceedings underway, I would like to invite Auntie Billawarra to provide us with a welcome to country. Auntie B.
Administrator, Mr O'Halloran. Darandira Gudlin Yua Bachua, Nayana Narling Billawarra, Namulikula Medijan Nadi, Nayana, Damagiri Yajani Tukal Medijan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Auntie Billawarra, but I'm happy for you to call me Auntie B. I am a member of the very large local Kabilo family, one of the 8 family groups that make up the Larrakia Nation, and I am the Larrakia Academic in Residence at Charles Darwin University. It's really great to be here with you all and to see so many familiar faces. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to Larrakia country, and I thank you for the respect you show us, the traditional custodians of the land we gather on this evening. I acknowledge dignitaries and pay my respects to other elders who are here today. And a big hello to all of you who have joined us by technology. To my brothers and sisters from other First Nations, a heartfelt welcome. I recognise the strength of spirit and depth of knowledge that exists in both the elders of the past and present, and I know the rich tapestry of the dreaming still runs strong in our mind, body and spirit. The Larrakia are the traditional custodians of the land and waters of the Greater Darwin region. And although our lands extend up to 50 kilometres inland, we are known as saltwater people. Over the years, I've been blessed to be at this event, and I was really happy to be at last year's lecture, which was presented by Linda Payey Ford, a wonderful, strong Aboriginal woman. And this afternoon, I am really grateful that I was asked to do the welcome for this year's orator, Thomas Mayer, a strong, passionate Torres Strait Islander man. And I'm really looking forward to what you have to tell us about today. So it is on that note, it is my privilege on behalf of my elders, past and present, to welcome you all to Gwawa Daranyiki, our land. Welcome to my saltwater home of great food, friendly people, beautiful beaches, spectacular sunsets and stunning electrical storms. Larrakia country is like a pearl with many layers of different peoples, of different cultures, all living and loving in this deeply spiritual place. You are leaving your footprints in Gull Medage and sand. When you leave, our message will stay with you. So I hope your stay in my country is a safe and nourishing one, that the spirits of my ancestors watch over you while you are here. All that I ask in return is that you walk softly on Mother Earth and treat her with love and respect as the Larrakia people do. And if you are walking softly and you are listening closely, you will hear the deep, rich, ancient voices of my ancestors singing the song lines across this beautiful land I call home. Please stay safe and well during these really difficult times, and happy Nadoc from the Larrakia Nation. Mamak Bachua. Thank you. See you later.
Thank you, Auntie B. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to have you here and to hear you speak. I appreciate that. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the Larrakia people as traditional owners of the beautiful country that we're meeting on this evening, and to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, both those who are with us tonight and across this country. The Eric Johnston Lecture is an annual event. It's named in honour of the late Commodore Eric Johnston, who was Administrator of the Northern Territory from 1981 to 1989 and who delivered the first lecture in 1986. So every year we're privileged to hear from someone who draws upon our history to talk about an issue of relevance to our collective future. This week is Nadoc Week, and the theme always was, always will be, recognises that First Nations people have occupied and cared for this continent for over 65,000 years. I'm therefore particularly pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Thomas Mayer, a proud Torres Strait Islander man born on Larrakia land. From a union background representing the rights of maritime workers, Thomas has also become a strong champion for Indigenous rights, and the signatory to and passionate advocate for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. He is the author of Finding the Heart of the Nation, The Journey of the Uluru Statement Towards Voice, Treaty and Truth, and has travelled extensively around Australia to garner support for a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice and a Makarrata Commission for agreement making and truth-telling. And truth-telling being a value, of course, which libraries and archives very much hold dear. The message of the Uluru Statement from the Heart has resonated across the country. It has been published in over 60 languages, been introduced to school and university curriculums, been told through children's books, and has inspired songwriters. Thomas, thank you so much for agreeing to deliver the 2020 Eric Johnston Lecture, When the Dreaming Becomes Us. We're looking forward to hearing from you about your journey and your vision. Thank you too for allowing us to reproduce that beautiful artwork on the wall tonight. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Thomas Mayer.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for your introduction and kind words. Thank you, Arnie B, for your welcome to country. I'd also like to, before I begin, give a special thank you to your staff, Patrick, Helen, Amy and Charlie, who have been a great help for me to make it up onto this stage. I acknowledge Her Honour, the Administrator, and the Honourable Vicky O'Halloran and your husband, Mr O'Halloran. I also want to acknowledge Jamesie Paik and Naria Kit, Joel Bowden, if you're here, members of Parliament, my mum. First time I think mum's been to a speech that I'm making, so I'm pretty nervous, not just because mum's here, but I'm on my home turf. And I'm reading a speech because I usually speak off the cuff. For the last 3 years, I don't think I've written a speech. Thanks to my very patient wife for being here, my 2 children, William and Ruby, my 2 older children, Shayla and Tia. I want to thank all my family that's here, my sister, cousins, Auntie Maisie. Thanks for coming along. And also I want to thank the Gurindji mob for coming all the way from Kalkarindji for this speech. And Daguragu, I really appreciate you coming all this way. And I also want to acknowledge Sammy Wilson, Jama Uluru. And I said to him as we walked in, this is your show, you know, you've got the Uluru Statement up here and the that very special poster up there. Sammy is Jama Uluru, and this is a great honour to be speaking in front of you about this, mate. I also acknowledge it's Remembrance Day today and pay my respects to all Australia's fallen soldiers, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and men who fought to defend their home soil right here on this continent, lest we forget. So I'll begin. In the 1963 Yirrkala Bark petition, in defence of their lands from a mining company and a hostile government, the Yolngu people said that the people of this area fear that their needs and interests will be completely ignored as they have been ignored in the past, and they fear that the fate which has overtaken the Larrakia tribe will overtake them. The Yolngu people's fears, and certainly the white perpetrators' expectations, were that the Larrakia people would soon cease to exist. So again, before I begin this lecture, I must acknowledge that the Larrakia people have survived. I pay my respects to all Larrakia people, those in the room, and your elders past and present. I acknowledge that you have not only survived, you rise. The blood in the soil and the blood in your veins is proof that you, the Larrakia, are the rightful sovereign owners of this place. I'm honoured to stand before you today to conduct this lecture in the name of a great Darwin leader, Eric Johnston. One of the ways I prepared for today was to visit the Libraries and Archives NT website to listen to recordings of Eric Johnston's speeches and to read several of the Eric Johnston lectures from the past. When I listened to Eric Johnston's voice, I sensed his humility. I laughed with his sense of humour, and I admired how he brought people together. For those who don't know, Commodore Eric Johnston was a naval officer commanding Northern Australia when Cyclone Tracy struck in 1974, and he was highly commended for his outstanding leadership in raising modern Darwin from the rubble the cyclone left behind. Johnston went on to become the administrator of the Northern Territory, and he was much loved because he saw it as his duty to represent the aspirations of all Territorians. To do this, he often travelled to the remotest of Aboriginal communities, and he established unprecedented relationships in his role. It is fitting, therefore, that in this lecture that bears his name, I share how the Uluru Statement from the Heart's proposal for a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice is, like Eric Johnston's achievements in Darwin, about building a greater Australia, one where we are all heard, and further, where we can look within ourselves for the courage to fight for it as Territorians. Today's lecture is based on a different crisis to Darwin's in 1974, though it can be compared metaphorically as a cyclone, much worse than Tracy. The crisis I speak of began with the arrival of Captain Cook, who planted a flag on a small island in my people's country in the Torres Strait, falsely proclaiming the doctrine of terra nullius, that this continent and adjacent islands were uninhabited. For thousands of years, that island was named Bedanlug. Cook renamed it Possession Island. Sadly for my people, Cook was merely the edge of the most devastating cyclone these ancient lands have ever seen. His coming was like the eerie calm before a murderous storm. The worst of the storm came with the First Fleet, with the colonies that screamed through the east, south, west, and then the north and centre. The settlers behaved more like the invaders do. They wrought devastation across a uniquely wonderful people, unique being the oldest living cultures and the most peaceful structures on the planet. Experts agree the people of the First Nations were not a conquering people. How else could it be that so many unique languages evolved on one common continent? We knew what land we belonged to, rather than what land we aspired to possess. There is so much to learn from us. For the first 200 years of the colonial storm, entire families, clans, and nations were torn, roots and all, from the earth. Languages, dances, traditions, mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, blown into the nether, never to be seen again. After more than 200 years, this storm has not ended. The statistics and the lamentations of failure in successive annual Closing the Gap reports, delivered by Prime Ministers who have always failed, are like a Saffir-Simpson wind scale. While First Nations people are still battered by the winds of disproportionate incarceration, chronic disease, suicide and impoverishment, it still measures an awful gale. When you listen to this summation of our plight, surely you must wonder, how can it be that so many First Nations people suffer in a country as rich as ours? How can it be when a majority of Australians today say they know the truth of our past and wish for reconciliation? How can it be, if you're truly not racist, if you believe that we are human just like you? If we are human like you, and if we had a peaceful, happy existence before Cook's deadly proclamation, then surely you must agree that the problem lies not with the nature of Indigenous people, but in how we are heard in the Australian political system. The answer to the question of how is in our voicelessness when decisions are made in Parliament. Before I go on, let me share some context on how I understand how a voice will help my people. My first job was on the wharves. I was 17, just out of year 12. It was a dream job for me. I wanted to work outdoors and I wanted to be by the sea. One of the benefits of working down the wharf was the fishing. As I would drive down to the wharf to start work, I'd put crab pots in. I'd pick them up on the way home and often catch a feed. So often, my kids must have thought that I was a professional fisherman. because when I put my work clothes on, they'd ask, "Are you going fishing, Dad?" It was while working on the wharf that I learnt the importance of politics, democracy, and in particular, unity. Not unity as a catch cry at a march or in a speech like this, just a rallying word. No. I learnt that effective, long-lasting unity requires structure, resources, the accountability of leaders, and hard work and compromise amongst those who are to be united. I learnt that these factors are vital to be able to defend and further your rights and interests, especially in 1998. On the 8th of April in 1998, I was a young father, not quite 21 years old, with 2 babies already. I remember my bewilderment in the months leading up to that day, seeing the constant barrage of Wharfie demonisation from coalition politicians and an eagerly compliant media. While they claimed we were lazy, unproductive, they ignored the bottlenecks on the wharf, the poor management, and just the simple fact that it should be okay for workers to leverage for reasonable conditions of employment and decent pay, especially when your labour generates millions of dollars of profit. Eventually I found out why we were being publicly bashed from pillar to post. It was a misinformation campaign, softening up the Australian public for an all-out assault. I heard about it on the radio early that morning, driving onto Fort Hill Wharf for a day shift. The news bulletin informed me that through the night, while most Australians were sleeping, Patrick Stevedores, a major waterside worker employer and part owner of the company I worked for, in collusion with the Howard government, moved balaclava-clad mercenaries through the gates on the land and up onto the wharves from small rubber dinghies on the sea. It was a military-like manoeuvre. Some had vicious Rottweiler dogs, barking and salivating at the end of loosely held leash. These masked men had dragged around 1,400 wharfies from our workplace and locked us and our families out of our livelihoods. I thought I had lost my job. But fortunately for us in Darwin, though, in a company not yet fully owned by Patrick Stevedores, here we were not locked out. And so in line with the union strategy to keep the community on board, we continued to work wherever we could. As the dispute escalated on the picket lines around the nation, we learnt of the corporate manoeuvre at play, the good old dodgy restructure. In the lead up to the lockout, the unionised workforce's employment was quietly shifted by Patrick's to a subsidiary company with no physical assets, a disposable company established so that when the timing was right, the parent company could terminate the contract and legally replace us. As a young worker, I wondered, what chance do we have? A bunch of wharf labourers versus very rich men in an ideological government? But after only several dramatic months, we had fought back on the streets and in the courts, and we won. It was an exhilarating moment when the High Court ruled in our favour. I remember watching my comrades down south marching back into the gates, smiling at the scowling bosses as they walked past. It made my heart swell with joy, but there was also sadness. From the stress caused to the workers and their families, not all of us made it through. The way the bosses treated workers in that dispute shaped my understanding of unity, or in other words, it showed me the power of a strong representative voice and how a government will do anything it takes to silence it. I used the anecdote of the Patrick Stevedores and John Howard's attack on the MUA in 1998, partly to demonstrate a similar tactic. If you're around in the days of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, a commission established by Bob Hawke to deliver on a proposal in the 1988 Ururu Statement, where our people proposed a national representative body, a voice. You may recall that John Howard, who had vehemently opposed the establishment of the commission in opposition, destroyed it at his earliest opportunity as Prime Minister. John Howard, a master of divide and conquer, demonised black leaders, the same way he demonised wharfies. He amplified the issues instead of fixing them. He understood that if you take away the structures behind the leverage of unity, you can silence a people's voice. He tried it on the wharves to deunionise workers and he failed, but he succeeded at dividing us. In 2005, he simply repealed the enacting legislation in Parliament. The misinformation bombardment was successful. When he destroyed ATSIC, there was barely a whimper. The other thing that I learnt on the wharves was the fact that we didn't use our union voice for our own wages and conditions alone. We used our strength to build a better Australia. Unions have won standards for all workers, minimum standards such as 4 weeks of annual leave, 10 days of personal leave, minimum award wages and conditions, superannuation, weekends, the 8-hour day and maternity leave. And for a while now, we have been campaigning for a new standard, domestic violence leave, again, for all workers. And how would we be as a nation now if unions hadn't fought for Medicare, the universal health care we all enjoy? Would we rather be like the United States, where if you have no money, you are bankrupted to keep your loved ones alive or they die? If workers never built a voice, this would be a very different country today. There would hardly be a middle class. Instead, most of us would be the working poor. Obviously, I'm a proud union member, a proud Indigenous union member, because unions have been integral to the success of my people's struggle to be counted. In the past 100 years, unions have stood with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our struggle for equality and our rightful place in this country. In the 1920s, the first all-Aboriginal political organisation, the Aboriginal Progressive Association, was led by an Aboriginal member of my union, a Wharfie, and his name was Fred Maynard. Unions backed Indigenous people in the 1946 Pilbara strike, in the 1957 Palm Island strike. We backed the Yolngu people in 1963 around the Yirrkala Bark petitions, and here, in the 1970s on Larrakia land, the Larrakia land rights paper Bungie was printed in the union office just down there on the wharves where I started work. Then, of course, there is the most powerful protest, immortalised in image and song by a handful of sand, the Gurindji Wave Hill Walk-Off. I'll digress now to acknowledge my Gurindji friends in the room. Thank you, Rosie, Lisa, Double R, Phillip, Jamesie, Wilemina, Michael, Quitaysha, and the Gurindji Corp CEO, Phil Smith, for travelling all the way from Kalkarindji and Daguragu yesterday to hear this oration. These men and women are the children of Vincent Lingiari and the walk-off mob. It wasn't at school that I learnt about the Wave Hill walk-off. Again, it was on the wharves. For those who know little about the walk-off, let me tell you a brief version of their story and how it relates to the call for a constitutional voice. The Buchanan Highway cuts through Gurindji land, just as a land-hungry white man did, Nat Buchanan, when he moved great herds of cattle onto the grassy plains. Buchanan, who the South Australian government granted almost all the Gurindji people's land to for a bargain, used the Gurindji people to build the first stockyards with chains around their necks. The Buchanan family eventually sold the station to the British Lord Vestey for a handsome sum, and things didn't get any better. Gurindji mob under Lord Vestey died at a rate that surpassed their reproduction. As any intelligent businessman would do, Lord Vestey sought expert advice, and the anthropologist that visited the station advised, and not verbatim, you just need to feed the wretched Aboriginals more and give them a piece of tin over their head, at least, if you want them to reproduce more slaves. Things improved a little from there. At best, the Aboriginal workers on Wave Hill Station were paid rations and a small amount of coin. The living conditions remained poor. They weren't even given the time to inter their dead. The straw that broke the camel's back was when the unions and their Aboriginal members won an equal wages case in the Arbitration Commission. It was a bittersweet success. The Commissioner gave the cattle industry 3 more years of slavery, so those poor rich cattle barons could adjust. Then the blackfellow could get a fair wage On the wharves, I worked with an old man named Brian Manning, and I acknowledge Brian Manning's family if they're here in the room today. Brian was a Wharfie and a great mentor of mine. He told me the story of when he, Aboriginal Union organiser Dexter Daniels and star of the silver screen, Tudawali, heard Vincent Lingiari was in town with a broken leg. They went and saw him to promise that outside support should his people choose to go on strike. And strike they did in 1966. When Lingiari returned to the station, he looked the station manager in the eye and warned they would walk. That morning, he led around 200 Aboriginal stockworkers, domestics and their families, from slavery and into a 9-year fight for freedom. The walk-off was about so much more than equal wages. They dared to struggle to live on their land their way. It became a standoff for land rights and self-determination. When the Gorton and McMahon governments refused the Gurindji's reasonable demands, Lingiari travelled to the big city of lights, visiting universities, union offices and wharves. Their efforts rallied solidarity on the streets and gained the funds needed to sustain the strike. Boycotts of Vesti's products were organised by unions internationally. The pressure was on. Your people's courage sparked the land rights movement. And after 6 long years of struggle, withstanding, sometimes barely, the tactics of division and intimidation, the Gurindji people's luck changed in 1972 with the election of a rare, visionary Prime Minister named Gough Whitlam. Whitlam had proclaimed during his election campaign that Australians are diminished until Indigenous people gain their rightful place. He also promised land rights. In 1975, Prime Minister Whitlam travelled to Gurindji land to conduct a historic ceremony. Surrounded by dignitaries and media, the much taller Prime Minister leant towards a tired and weary old Vincent Lingiari, symbolically pouring a handful of sand into his palm. The Prime Minister said, "Vincent Lingiari, I solemnly hand to you these deeds as proof in Australian law that these lands belong to the Gurindji people, and I put into your hands part of this earth itself as a sign that this land will be the possession of you and your children forever." The bravery of the Gurindji people to walk off Wave Hill Station while knowing that only 40 years before their peoples were mercilessly massacred is as admirably rebellious as was the Eureka Stockade. Their determination to hold out for their goal, the return of stolen land, in the face of incredible adversity and then to win, was as honourably patriotic as the Anzacs on the beaches of Gallipoli. For most Australians, though, 23 August goes by and they are oblivious of the significance of that date. But on Gurindji land, the anniversary of the walk-off is marked by the Freedom Day Festival. I want to congratulate you, my Gurindji friends, for building a festival over the years. It should be an anniversary marked in every Australian calendar, and it should be a national public holiday. Next year is the 55th anniversary, and all going well with COVID, it'll be the biggest and best ever. I'm told that Kev Carmody and Paul Kelly may go. How amazing would it be to be there, listening to them singing, "From little things, big things grow," while staring into the same starry sky that Vincent Lingiari did on Gurindji land. Though there is much to celebrate, there remains unfinished business. You see, when First Nations win land back, those lands remain subject to the laws and policies made in Parliament. For the Gurindji who soon followed their dream to run their own cattle station, they were hobbled by the control of white advisors and the regulations that enforced the European priorities of land use to maximise the exploitation of the lands and waters for maximum profits. It is one thing to regain your land, but if you cannot influence the laws and policies made in Canberra, you cannot yet live on your land your way. Still today, while the laws and policies are deficient, the Gurindji continue to fight. And I'll mention that recently they have been in dispute with the company Winbox, who have challenged their native title and allegedly have desecrated the heritage-listed walk-off track without a permit. That this dispute has gone on for you for such a long period of time, causing stress to your families without remedy, says a lot about how we still have a long way to go. Again, your experience tells us we badly need a voice. I'll turn now to one final lesson I learnt toward the proposal for a constitutionally enshrined voice in the Uluru Statement. This lesson goes to the questions of how effective our advocacy is today and why it is time to do something different. By 2010, after 16 years as a labourer on the wharf, I was elected by my fellow seafarers, port workers, divers and wharfies to be their union official. For a quiet man who barely said a word for most of his life, the fight to protect what the union elders had achieved for us had thrust me, reluctantly, into leadership. Suddenly I was negotiating agreements and handling legal industrial disputes and learning to run meetings and speak before a crowd. In the tradition of my union, with the full support of the membership, I began to spend more time in community organising. A moment that inspired me to do more for the rights of my people came in Raintree Park. Around 24 hours before, I saw a young local woman, whose family name will be familiar, Jessie Bonson, calling out on Facebook for support to ensure Darwin was a part of a national day of rallies, decrying the decision of the Tony Abbott government to cut hundreds of millions of dollars from services vital to remote Indigenous communities. The Western Australian government fell into line, announcing the closure of Aboriginal communities, and people were angry. Within a mere 48 hours, Jessie pulled together a rally. I remember it was raining in Raintree Park that afternoon, yet still around 30 people turned up. I admired her efforts when no one else took the lead. It was then that I decided we had to do more to help. So I helped Jess organise a rally a couple of weeks later, perhaps the biggest protest Darwin had seen for many years at that point. But after several more rallies, and then the next crisis, youth in detention, and then the next crisis, another death in custody, rally after rally, a pattern emerged, and I began to wonder, how can we do better? The pattern was, when there is an injustice or harmful decision in Parliament, there is anger, and it is easier to turn out great numbers on the street. Subsequent actions turn out less numbers. At best, there is some change or the promise of an inquiry. Then there is no protest. We go back to our lives. Time goes by and there may be some recommendations from an inquiry, recommendations that are rarely fully enacted. Inevitably soon, the next injustice or harmful decision in Parliament happens, and so the cycle repeats, as it did earlier this year. Earlier this year was the opportunity that Black Lives Matter movement gave us to put a mirror to Australia's face, to say, hey, look here. What about David Dungay Jr., who was filmed in custody, calling out, I can't breathe, as he died pinned to the floor, the same as George Floyd in America. With that opportunity and the greatest numbers we have ever seen in this country, 1 million people marched with us against deaths in custody around Australia. We still see no justice, no reforms. The death toll still rises and the crowds disperse. If we are to honestly assess the effectiveness of our advocacy today, we are falling well short of the mark. No politician has been held to account for their failures. There is no repercussion in a democracy where we are only 3%. This was another reason to build a constitutional voice. On the morning of 26 May 2017, with more than 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives from all points of the southern sky, we gathered in a large hall named the Uluru Meeting Place. On one side of the hall was a massive Torres Strait Islander flag, and on the other an equally large Aboriginal flag. We were there in the heart of the country as representatives chosen by our own people at 13 regional dialogues to bring our region's priorities together and to attempt to synthesise them and do the hard work of building a consensus. It was with bated breath that we watched Cobble Cobble Woman and public law expert Professor Megan Davis step up to the podium to read the Uluru Statement from the Heart for the very first time. She said, "We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of this Australian continent and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That a people's possessed a land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reform to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our own destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967 we were counted. In 2017 we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So that's what we heard at Uluru, and I hope you can sense what we felt. It was a very moving moment. And the priority reform in the Uluru Statement is to constitutionally enshrine a First Nations voice. And as in the Gurindji example, we know we need a voice so we can affect the policy and legislation decisions that affect us. As in my example of how unions exercise power, we need a voice to be politically coherent, consistent, and represented by leaders chosen by us, not the media or the powers that be. And in the example of the AAPA and the unmentioned many other representative voices we have had all the way through to ATSIC, we know that First Nations voices are destroyed by hostile governments. This is why we must have the courage of Lingiari to pursue a successful referendum so that our voice, this time, will last. We don't want to hold our breath each election. We want to guarantee our rightful place. I'll conclude with this. As Territorians, I believe the Northern Territory must take a lead in convincing the rest of the nation to lend us a hand to build a First Nations voice. The thing is, we have already been leading this campaign from as far back as when the Yolngu people in the Yirrkala Bark petition proposed that they be heard. Again, from here in Darwin, in the 1972 Larrakia petition to the Queen, when we called for political representation. And then in 1988, the Burunga Statement, when Bob Hawke came to that small community near Katherine and promised a treaty and promised a voice. And now the Uluru Statement from the heart, the greatest First Nations consensus and constitutional moment in this nation's history, happened here in the Northern Territory. And again, it called for a voice. The other reason we should be taking the lead in this campaign is the territory power in the Constitution. For those who are unaware, the federal government in Canberra has the power to do whatever they want with the territory. They ultimately rule supreme. This means that a treaty between the NT government and First Nations, without a collective national First Nations voice to hold the Commonwealth to account, will not be worth the paper it is written on. So the first step for the Territory government, if they are serious about meaningful treaties, must be to achieve a constitutional voice. Another is that we should be motivated by shame, the shame in the truth that the Territory, like all of Australia, was built from dispossession and massacres. The shame in the truth that there was a Rights for Whites movement and a Rights for Whites rallies as recently as the 70s here in the Territory. The shame in the truth that much of the time, still today, 100% of the youth in detention in the Northern Territory are Indigenous. Should motivate us. Lastly, our motivation should be to protect Territorians. Protect Territorians from heinous acts like the 2007 intervention, when a federal government turned our own military onto our most vulnerable people in vulnerable communities based on a lie. There has never been a greater time to decide that we must build a better, more complete Australia. The greatest crisis we will ever face as human beings is looming. COVID, even colonisation, is nothing compared to accelerating climate change. We're on the brink of being able to do something to save our children's children, or being the ones who left it too late. And so, I will leave you with this thought. When Indigenous people have a voice in the centre of decision-making, so do the seas and rivers, the grasslands and forests, deserts, hills and mountains. Because we, the First Nations people, are the dreaming. And when we are empowered in the Constitution, the dreaming becomes us. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks so much. And I think I forgot to mention my bala here that come all the way from Mutitjulu, Sammy Wilson. Yeah, I did actually, yeah. That's right, Sammy Uluru. Such a long speech, it put me to sleep. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for sharing your story with us tonight and the very powerful message. And thank you for all of your work in increasing community understanding of the need for greater recognition for First Nations voices. I would now like to invite to the stage Her Honour the Administrator, the Honourable Vicky O'Halloran, to propose a vote of thanks.
Darandara, Tamangua Bajua, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Auntie Billawara, for officially welcoming us to country. Nyana, Vicky O'Halloran, Administrator, pay my respects to the Darabinari, Bawunjing, Naleji, Gadaba. I also acknowledge all First Nations people here this evening. It is a great privilege to join you for the 2020 Eric Johnston Lecture. Now in its 34th year, the Eric Johnston Lecture covers a range of topics relevant to the history and culture of our Northern Territory, each one reflecting the speaker's passion in their area of knowledge and expertise. Tonight's lecture, delivered by Mr. Thomas Mayer, a remarkable Territorian and Torres Strait Islander man, was heartfelt and compelling. To Thomas's mum, Liz, who is here this evening, his children, Shayla, Tia, William and Ruby, and his wife, Melanie, you all must be very proud of your incredible son, father, and husband. There are some things that cannot be learned by reading books, or by being in a classroom, or researched online, but rather than through lived experiences. In the lead up to this lecture, I took the time to read Thomas's book, Finding the Heart of the Nation, and I was moved by Thomas's passion, pride, and commitment to sharing the voices and vision of our First Nations people from all parts of this vast continent. This week, we celebrate Nadoc Week, a time for embracing and learning about the significant importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history and culture, and the immense contributions made to our nation by First Nations people. The theme always was, always will be, alongside Thomas's words here tonight, reinforces that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have lived and learned and loved on this land that we now share for more than 65,000 years. We, as Australians, are privileged to be able to trace a history that goes back thousands of generations, and it would be amiss to not fully embrace, encourage, and learn from one of the oldest continuing cultures on this planet. We are nothing if not for those who have been before us. Let our children, our emerging leaders, look back and reflect on the progress we must make and the solutions that we create. On behalf of us all here tonight and those joining us virtually, thank you, Thomas, for sharing your poignant address. It has certainly given us all much to reflect on. Thomas extends an invitation to listen, a visit if welcome, and he says respect always and learn. With our hearts and minds open, these are the steps we can all take to achieve real and meaningful change. I would like to conclude this vote of thanks with an excerpt from one of my favourite parts of Thomas's book, which also embodies his lecture tonight, and I quote, "On the morning of Christmas Eve, my 7-year-old son Will, came to my side carrying his favourite novel, Hot Dog by Anne Doe. William is one of the best readers in his class, far ahead of his age group. He makes me incredibly proud. Dad, what will the name of your book be?" he asked. I closed my laptop, turned to him and said, "What would you call my book?" He smiled a devilish grin, which I can see right now, and with practiced precision, he put his hand under his armpit and responded with a series of armpit farts. We laughed, both childishly. "I love kids at this age," said Thomas, "when the smallest things are still funny." I said to him, "The name of my book will be Finding the Heart of the Nation. William looked at me, somewhat puzzled. Finding the heart of the nation? Where is the heart of the nation? I pulled my son close. I looked at him in the eyes and I smiled. I put my hand on his heart and said, "The heart of the nation is here." Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Mr. Thomas Mayer, Go Thomas, thank you, and go well everyone.
Thank you very much, Your Honour. Thank you to all of you for coming along tonight. Thank you for everyone who watched along online. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I now invite you to stay, enjoy some light refreshments, some conversation, take a stroll through the exhibition if you like, have a chat to Thomas. The library's open till 8 o'clock tonight, so there's no rush. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you again, Thomas.